Kia ora koutou, ko Tom tōku ingoa. No Ahurerio, I'm from here in Napier. I whānau mai o I rungi te maunga Matarua hau. I was born on Napier Hill. Ka tahi ka Pakeke aki au I te maru o ngā maunga o Tātara, me Hikurangi, I te taha o te awa Tūtaikuri. So I was born here in Napier and I grew up in Taradale next to o Tātara Pā and the Tūtaikuri River. As mentioned, I work for Forest and Bird. I'm the freshwater advocate there. I've been there for most of the last 7 years in a few different roles. And basically, for the last year or year and a half, I have been leading this campaign on making room for rivers alongside some other work on freshwater. Basically, anything that relates to freshwater falls to me. The talk that I'm going to give this morning is something we have taken to a bunch of communities around Aotearoa. I'll talk about it, but we basically started this campaign pre-cyclone. The cyclone hit, we figured out this was a really important thing to communicate to the public and decision makers, and we just started going around the country talking to our Forest and Bird branches and getting in front of as many councils as we possibly could, whether it was through deputations or turning up at long-term plan hearings, all that kind of stuff. So this is a version of what we've been talking to communities about. Whether they would give us 5 minutes or an hour, we crammed in whatever we could. So I've crammed in as much as I can for you, and we can take some questions at the end. And as mentioned, Mike's got some maps that we've crammed in here as well. So we'll look specifically at Hawke's Bay, but this applies to across Aotearoa. So, I mean, I don't know if any of you recognize, how many people are from Hawke's Bay here? Okay, cool, only a couple. You might recognise this photo. This is the Tūtaikuri River. Sorry, I'll just get this right before so you can actually see things properly. And on the morning of the cyclone last year, 14th of February 2023, it feels like such a long time ago now, I was sitting in Wellington, basically looking at the weather reports and watching the flow gauges on this river, the Tūtaikuri. I've spoiled it for you, but you can probably guess why I was looking at the flow gauges on that river. And it is because my family still lives next to the Tūtaikuri. I sat in Wellington at work refreshing this gauge on the Tūtaikuri River on the Regional Council website, and basically watching as it rose through the night to something over 1,800 cubic metres per second. So 1,800 tonnes of water was flowing past that flow gauge every second. The gauge failed at about 3 a.m, so I was sitting there at about 8 a.m. refreshing the gauge, getting no more information, trying to figure out if that river was rising or falling. Turns out that the river was much closer to something like 4,000 cubic metres per second. Every cubic metre of water weighs a tonne, so 4,000 tonnes of water was flowing past that recording point every second. And my family was sitting downstream of that flow gauge, about 600 metres from the stop bank in 2 different houses. So my parents in one, my sister, my niece, nephew, brother-in-law in the other one. At about 8 o'clock, the river overtopped its stop banks. This is looking upstream. We can pull that curtain if anyone needs to, if you can't see, but basically the river overtopped the stop bank about 8 a.m, took out the Redcliffe substation. If everyone probably has heard, most of Napier lost power. That happened basically when the river took out that little substation there. And then about 10 o'clock, everyone in the suburbs nearby was being told to evacuate, including my family in Taradale. So this is looking downstream. There's the bridge across the river. This is Waiheke here, a golf course in here, and Taradale here, and at the bottom of the old o Tātara Pā there up on the hill. And the river was just spilling into the streets. My sister's street there on the left, and in the middle, this is looking back towards where my parents' place is, a couple of 100 metres away around the corner. And I mean, they were really lucky, thankfully. They evacuated, they were told to evacuate, a bit slow in my opinion, but they left, and they were allowed back later that day. Water came up under my sister's house, thankfully not quite to the floorboards, and my parents' place was just that little bit higher and stayed dry, so they went off to friends, came back. Camped out without power for 8 days or something, and a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old or whatever it was, but otherwise they were okay. We went back and stood in the riverbed about here about a month or 2 later, just as a bit of a mark. There's the bottom of the Pā. We came forward to here, so that's the bottom of the Pā there. Stop bank here, Taradale in here, basically what happened was the water backed up against the bridge. It seems the water kind of backed up against the bridge when a whole bunch of stuff got crammed up against it. The stop bank here had just been raised a couple of months earlier, raised and strengthened, but water snuck around the top of the bridge, down this road, all over this edge, all through EIT, down this main road and into the streets of Taradale. That's my sister's street in there and where those photos were taken. And yeah, basically took out a few houses, but mostly stayed in the road. So into this area here, water just came all through here. I've got a friend who lives in here. She was standing in there, said she could see the water, feel the water rising and falling as they were getting stuff and getting into their car. But basically water came all the way down here, down to the school and out into the stormwater network, basically. As I say, my family were lucky, but further up the road, the bridge was taken out. The valley upstream was basically flattened. And more widely across the region, you can kind of step back and see pre-cyclone how, I guess, clean, for want of a better word, the landscape was compared to post-cyclone, how covered in silt the region became. And when you step back and look at that against things like the stop bank network, so this is showing all the stop banks across this area of Hawke's Bay. There's Napier there, sort of Hastings just off the map here. All these lines are the stop banks. This is a couple of months after the cyclone. All the yellow lines are the pieces of the stop banks that were still intact. The orange is bits that have been weakened. Red was breached. Green was repaired at this stage already, so it had either been weakened or breached. You can see down by Taradale, a bit of it had been weakened or breached. And you can see the number of spots where the stop bank was compromised, basically. And while Taradale flooded, it got off pretty lightly. Other places were completely inundated with water, and you can actually see that basically when water came through or over the stop bank on both sides through this gap and through all these breaches, it came into this area here around Pakawhai. And then because the stop bank network meets at this corner, that water had nowhere to go. So it filled up like a bath. And the pumps that usually pump water out of that failed because they were just completely inundated. And the water rose to a depth of something like 5 or 6 metres, the height of a stop bank, before it could drain back over the top of that stop bank naturally. So that's why we saw people in that area being rescued from their rooftops in helicopters and boats. That water had come so deep that it was literally at the top of their rooftops. And you can see other houses out here. More localised effects, I guess, in other places. This is the Ngaruroro River at Omahu, pre-cyclone. You can see the stop bank along here, the lime pathway. Post-cyclone, you can see the number of breaches where the water has basically come over the stop bank, and then because stop banks are designed to have water on the inside, not the outside, the water gets onto the soft soil on the outside, erodes down and just eats back into the stop bank. So it hasn't actually blown out, it's been overtopped and then eaten down. Other places where the stop banks didn't breach, like Taradale, this is the bottom of the Pa again, we're really lucky in some ways that they weren't inundated. This was that bit of stop bank that had just been strengthened and heightened pre-cyclone. You look at it post-cyclone and you can see that was being eaten away at underneath the water. And of course other places completely inundated. This is Esk Valley, pre-cyclone. They don't have a stop bank network, just the whole valley floor flattened. Interestingly, if you wanted to have a stop bank network, it would have to be something like a 4-metre high stop bank. It would take up a third of the valley floor. You'd need to find enough material to build it. And even then, it would have been inundated by the cyclone. Other places we had lakes created where they haven't been for a very, very long time. This lake here created when the Tukituki River abandoned its old channel, its current channel, went into an old channel, filled up this depression in the landscape and then drained back into the Tukituki. The hillsides of Hawke's Bay pretty much stripped clear of soil, all ending up in the rivers downstream and on the floodplains. It was probably the biggest weather event we've recorded or experienced in Aotearoa, but it wasn't the only kind of extreme weather event we've had in recent times, right? We had Auckland 2 weeks before that seemed crazy at the time. I remember thinking Nelson's flooding was kind of unprecedented a couple of months before that. Tairāwhiti, Gisborne is hit regularly, something like 8 storms in the past 2 years or something. Bridges taken out all the time. Westport and the west coast generally hit regularly. Canterbury, the Ashburton and Hakatere River, this is it bursting its stop bank back in 2021, I think it was. Yep. The Rangitata River in 2019, bursting its bank, taking over its old floodplain again. And Edgecombe in 2017, which I kind of remember as that iconic quotation marks flood event. Not to mention things before that, right? The Manawatu in 2004, all sorts of things. Dr. Sam Dean from NIWA said after this that I have no doubt whatsoever in my mind across my experience of my life as a climate scientist that climate change has influenced that event. And Met Service said these events will become more severe as the planet continues to warm. That will mean heavier rain and more problems from flooding. And we're seeing that play out, right? So last year, the rain in Auckland, this is a cumulative rain graph basically at Auckland Airport. So we've got rain up the side here, 1.5 metres at the top. These are the days of the year across the bottom, so basically January through to December. All these grey lines are previous years, previous records. I think the coloured lines are maybe more recent years. And then 2023 is here. And this straight line here is the Auckland anniversary weekend floods. People might have seen stories in the news about Antarctic ice melting faster than we thought it was going to melt. Temperatures rising faster than we thought they were going to rise. Things are not looking good on the climate change front in terms of more extreme weather. So what does that mean in terms of hazard probabilities, flooding, things like that for us? To take a quick tangent off into hazard probabilities, I've borrowed these from a woman called Belinda Story. She's simplified this into just a bit of an idea of what this kind of extreme weather means for things like our stop bank networks and things like that. So if you imagine that this black line here, this normal distribution is our current distribution of hazards in Aotearoa. So say, just for the sake of, we've got 0 here and then negatives and positives. Most of our weather would fall in this big main part of the distribution, right? That's the stuff, high probability, happens all the time, pretty regular stuff. Our extreme events are often the tail ends. That's where we have low probability. So this extreme event here at the number 2 with this little black area, that little black area is the area, the probability basically of that extreme event happening. So it's relatively low. But as the climate changes, it's gonna distort that probability, drag it out, and basically what we think of as our extreme becomes much more probable. It becomes that red area, and we get a new extreme out the end as that distribution shifts. And that has implications for things like our stop bank network. This is a graph of the infrastructure time to failure of basically a piece of infrastructure. So up the side here, we've got the probability of exceedance or failures from 0 to 100%. We've got years along the bottom, 2023 to 2073. This is basically saying if we built something in year 1 now, what's the chance of it failing across its lifetime as a result of these hazards? So say we built a stop bank now across a 50-year lifetime. If we built that stop bank to a 1 in 100 year exceedance probability or 1% chance in any year that it would be overtopped, across its lifetime there would be a 40% chance of it being overtopped. It's a simplification, but it's a good one to illustrate the effect of changing that 1 in 100 year exceedance probability. So if that 1 in 100 year flood becomes a 1 in 50 year flood by 2050 because the weather patterns are changing, the chances of that stop bank being overtopped by 2050 becomes 62%. If that 1 in 100 year event becomes a 1 in 20 year event, the chances of that stop bank being overtopped become 92%. So we get almost certain chances of this stuff being overtopped in its lifetime. And if we look at something like a seawall and storm surge and things, we're expecting our 1 in 100 year events to become 1 in 10 or 1 in 5, or some people even say sort of 1 in 2. And the chance of those being overtopped basically becomes 100%, much sooner. So climate change is driving this problem in some ways. But it's also the way that we have mismanaged the natural environment. I probably don't need to tell you this stuff, but things like wetland clearance. So this is predicted historic wetland extent across Aotearoa. We had about 2.4 million hectares of wetland, we think. This is our current wetland extent, about 240,000 hectares left. We can look at a place like Hawke's Bay. Thank you, Mike, for putting some maps together for us. This is pre-human wetland extent. This isn't all of Hawke's Bay. This is Napier. We've got Hastings cut off down here. But across all of Hawke's Bay, we think we had about 127,000 hectares. You'll notice that Napier used to have this big wet area here that was lost when the earthquake in 1931 lifted that up. We can look in about 1878 at the wetlands that were mapped at that time, and then we can look now at the wetlands that we have left, and it's very little, 2,900 hectares across Hawke's Bay, probably elsewhere because not many on this section of map. And you can actually see all the drainage network that has been put in on this map, all those grid lines draining that, and how much of this has been brought up by the earthquake. So we've got about 97% loss in Hawke's Bay, which is, across Aotearoa, I think we've lost 90%. So we've got 10% left. Hawke's Bay, we've taken away more than that. Similar story for our forests. We used to have really heavy forest cover across Aotearoa. This is before Polynesian settlement, then we've got before European settlement, and then we've got now. This light green colour is exotic forest that we've put onto the hills, but we've basically stripped away the native forest and stripped away the ability of that forest to hold soil on the hillsides. Lost the wetlands, which are the sponges in the landscape, lost the forest, which is helping slow the water down. And where we've kept those forests, we've introduced pests, so deer and goats and possums and things. This is the Kaweka Forest Park, so upstream of those rivers that flooded in Hawke's Bay, upstream of the Ngaruroro in particular, for example. And what we've got here is two areas of the forest. One is, this one on the left is the most intensely hunted part of the forest, so that's the most hunting pressure there. Despite that hunting pressure, there is no understory left that is absolutely smashed. On the right here, we've got an area of the forest that has a deer exclusion fence around it, and you can just see how much better the undergrowth and the forest cover is in that area. So we're taking away that really important ground cover that helps slow water down, but also, and catch water in the canopy and all that kind of thing. But also, if this forest dies off or reaches the end of its life, there's nothing coming up underneath it to replace it. And we see that play out in the landscape, right? There's our lake that was created. If we look at that pre-cyclone, we can see it's dry. If we look at the predicted historic wetland extent map of Aotearoa, we can see that it's all predicted historic wetland extent. And Ngāti Kahungunu will tell you that. They'll be like, yeah, it was a wetland. We used to, mahinga kai. Of course, that was, we know that. Same thing with the hillsides. This is pre-cyclone Gabriel. Post-cyclone, you can see all these white lines are slips. All that soil is then carried downstream, caked into the riverbeds. This is Tutaikuri here, just mats of this sediment. So it's climate change, it's wetland loss, it's forest loss, and it's also the way we have encroached upon our rivers. So historically, our rivers had space to move around their floodplains, to spread across their floodplains and dissipate their energy. But as Europeans came, we basically took this European idea that the rivers, stay in one place, and we tried to pin them in one place. The rivers built our plains in Hawke's Bay, the Ruataniwha Plains, the Hiratonga Plains, all built out of river settlements, the Canterbury Plains, all built out of river settlements, but we've put these rivers into little boxes. So this is the Tukituki River in 1943. You can draw some rough lines around the space that river kind of was operating in between those sort of terraces, and then you can compare that to now, and you can see how much space we've taken away from these rivers. You can do this all the way down the river, and I've made something of a game of it. You can actually see an old channel up there, probably. The channel it's operating in now, you compare that to, or in 1943, sorry, you compare that to now, you can see again that space that's been taken away. The stop banks put in, willows put in, basically trying to turn these rivers into drains, get water out to sea as fast as possible. The idea was, you take something that is curved, that is got a gradual gradient on it, you straighten it, it steepens the gradient, you move the water and the sediment out to sea as fast as possible. But what that also does is increase the energy of that river and increase erosion and things like that. Waipukaro here, the Tukituki River going past it, straightened through there, the Ngaruroro River, big open wide braided river. Take that in 1950, you compare it to now, still big and open and braided, but lots of space taken away from it. This spot here at Omahu, this is the spot I was showing you with the stop bank breaches just here. This is upstream of it, this huge open area of braiding closed in. And Mike made us some cool little 3D images of this, just looking at various sections of the river. So this is as it comes. You can see how it's just a big floodplain and how that river's had its space taken away from it. Big terrace here. This is post-cyclone, so you can actually see that the water's been in there again. And then when you look at just those two areas, you know, this is 548 hectares lost, so 76% of that riverbed has been lost through that section alone, 75% of the riverbed's been lost through that section alone, 500 hectares. That's a huge amount of area for floodwaters to spill out, for example. In big areas like this, it's just, crazy to see how much riverbed's been lost. And it's not just the loss, the encroachment. You know, we think often of this happening in Canterbury rivers, for example, but it's not just a Canterbury River problem. It's an Aotearoa-wide problem. So it's not just the encroachment and the pinning in of these rivers, but it's actually the wide-scale engineering of them. This is Hawke's Bay pre-1931 earthquake. I think it actually says 1930 or something, but I'm not sure of the exact date versus when it was drawn. But this is the Tutaukuri River coming down here past Taradau. So we've got the Otatara Pas in here again. This is the lagoon that was there pre-cyclone, pre-earthquake. Napier up the top, Pakowhai down here. This is the Ngaruroro River coming out to the coast here. The coastline should be a bit further along. Basically, when Europeans came along, they decided that this river going up here was problematic for the development of Napier. And when this land lifted up after the earthquake, the river was shifted into this, channel here, right? So the river used to go along here. There's a road that follows it. You can see this bendy little orange line. That's River Bend Road. If you ever drive River Bend Road, it literally follows the river. The river still exists there. It's sort of a drain now. The Tutaukuri was shifted to match up with the Ngaruroro. The Ngaruroro actually used to flow out down here. So that's its channel in the Clive River, although the Clive's now got a new name, which I'm going to forget. But there was an overflow channel put in, and then the river was shifted into that overflow channel. The Tutaukuri was put into its channel, and they were brought together at Waitangi Estuary here, which then, of course, created this area, which then flooded when the cyclone hit. So, you know, that's not to say that we necessarily would have wanted the Tutaukuri flowing through the middle of Napier, but one of those unintended consequences of engineering our rivers. And if anyone's interested, we've chucked a bunch of that imagery up online and are trying to get more of those maps up. Many councils have their own historic imagery. Hawke's Bay doesn't yet. But it's so important to understand the stories of where our rivers have been. So we're trying to fill that gap where we can. And it's all scales, it's all sorts of rivers, it's not just the big ones. This is the stream I grew up next to. Our house is just down the road from this. I think it's a type of stream tributary. I always used to give the Leith River in Dunedin crap for this, but then I thought about what's my local river in Wellington, and it's this. It flows under the road in Aral Valley. It's the Waimapihi stream, disappears into a culvert in the reserve. And these are a bunch of the streams that flow underneath Wellington. You can actually see this one's still got a stony bottom in it. There's fish, there's tuna in them. The council did a survey a while back. But they're there, we just don't know about them. So there's a whole bunch of unintended consequences to managing our rivers like this. Again, I probably don't need to tell you, but things like habitat loss. Our rivers need that diverse mosaic of habitat, the riffles, the little rapids, the runs, which are those smooth flowing areas, the pools, which are the deeper areas where we go swimming and stuff. Different fish like different parts of the mosaic. Tuna, for example, in those pools. So when we straighten our rivers, we basically we shorten that, we change that gradient, and we turn them usually just into one big long run, so they become just a smooth flowing, uniform depth, uniform width, and they lose that diversity of habitat for macroinvertebrates and fish and things. But we also lose things like the swimming holes that we could so enjoy. So there's a huge consequence of that. But then there's a whole bunch of other consequences that I guess people think of being sort of as more human-centric. One is aquifer recharge. We have these huge, big, braided rivers across old gravelly floodplains. When they have space to spread out, they have this sort of spongy old gravel medium underneath them that acts as like an intermediary in between them and the groundwater beneath. So when we cut into that, when we narrow the river, we basically take away the space that that river has to fill that sponge and then fill the aquifer, and we keep pumping from the aquifer, the water levels drop, and we don't let them recharge because we're not giving the river that space to recharge the aquifer. And we also find that by narrowing and steepening the rivers cut down into that, and as they cut down, they take the groundwater table with them. So this is something that's happening on the Waido River, something happening in the Ngaruroro, and it's happening in the Selwyn, probably other places as well, but that's where studies are going on. And then we talk about building big dams and storage ponds and everything when we're depleting that big storage that we have, or not refilling the storage that we have under the ground. Another thing that happens is we get these perched riverbeds. This is a cross-section from Central Hawke's Bay of the Tukituki River. So this is the river here flowing down or up towards us, or whatever way you want to imagine. This is its floodplain. This kind of, you can imagine how through time it's dropped sediment and built that kind of alluvial shape. But then we've put stop banks in, these grey lines. And basically once we put those stop banks in, the river has nowhere to go with its sediment but up or to cut down. But in a lot of situations, our rivers are just building up between those stop banks. So a river isn't just water, it's also all the sediment and stuff that's coming down with it. We're a young country, we have lots of erosion. And what we're finding is these riverbeds are building up between the stop banks. The riverbed becomes perched, and then we have these towns on the outside at a lower elevation than the river. So we have rivers that are perched up above the towns, and if those rivers ever decided to leave their channels, it would be very hard to put them back. Franz Josef Township is a really good example of this. I didn't manage to put a cross-section in, but basically Franz Josef Township is at one elevation. They've got a huge big stop bank, and then the river is something like 4 or 8 metres or something above the height of the township. And they basically are having to build that stop bank up to keep up with the rate that the river is infilling, because it's, you know, the Southern Alps dropping huge amounts of sediment with a glacier that is disappearing. So hence you might have seen in the news stories about trying to give that river some more space to slow that erosion. Another thing that we end up doing with these rivers is we chase our tails. This is the Manawatu River in Palmerston North, 1949, Palmerston North here. The river's flowing down this way. This is the Teachers College down here, if you know where that is. That's sort of where the channel used to go. You can actually see that they had put a cut in here in this stage, but we're not going to talk about that cut. We're going to talk about these spots here. Basically, in 1949, this bend here was causing the council a bit of concern, or whatever the council was at the time. They were worried that the river might break out and flow into this suburb here, Hawke, which actually wasn't that developed at the time, but that was the concern. Nothing was done about it for quite a long time, until in the 90s, they straightened that section of river, basically trying to pull it away from coming around that corner or risking bursting through into Hawke. What it seems like that has done is taken the energy that was being dissipated against that corner as it was running up against the bank and slowing down, and fired it down towards this hairpin bend on the corner here. That was fine back in 1949. This is a big marine terrace. There was one house on the top of the hill, no big deal. But in the 2010s, that was turned into a housing development. And unfortunately, despite all the advice about all the dust that was coming off this erosion anyway and causing problems and blah, 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 this bend then had to be lined with rock, and the marine terrace, which was kind of an iconic landscape of Palmerston North, has been sort of grassed over and turned into this boring bank. So one change upstream creates a change downstream, which then has a cost, which then often creates another change downstream again. And we're constantly chasing the river because it takes its energy elsewhere, basically. The regional council there has acknowledged that this is an unsustainable approach, which is very nice, but you know, it's the first step. But it just shows that this idea that these rivers should stay in one place is really entrenched. This is the Pahongana River that recently, last year, did a bit of damage into the reserve here, and the Mayor of Palmerston North basically said the council needs to get in there and fix this straight away. You know, to his credit, there is a bridge downstream and stuff that you need to think about, the state highway, but I think he was talking about this, And the regional council had already spent something like $1 million on rock lining and things and stuff. And to their credit, they said, walk around it. It's fine. Go on the grass. But yeah, conflicting things, but this idea is everyone thinks the river should stay where it is, but it just completely goes against what we know our rivers to do, right? Which is that they move through time, often on scales that we can't imagine, sometimes at scales we see directly. But this is the Manawatu River, Palmerston North's just up over here. These are all the old meander bends that river has cut through time. Yeah, pretty incredible. So this is the marine terrace here. Down here is Foxton Estuary, yeah. And we see that sort of entrenched, the river must stay in place when we look at how we've developed across Aotearoa. So this is another stream in Palmerston North, the Mangaone. 1949, you can see at this point, I think they've started to put some banks in alongside it. And basically, once that happens, it's a bit like you build a road, more cars come, you build a stop bank, everyone goes, great, that's safe, dry land, and they just move in. So that now looks like this, and we've just infilled behind it. We basically have this situation where we have a small stream that's hemmed in with, sometimes concrete and bricks and things like that. Big stop banks. It looks comical, but I used to live in that suburb. You can walk along the top of the stop bank and look down into people's backyards. And basically when that water, when that river floods, water has nowhere to go but up. So as that water fills in that narrow space, instead of dissipating its energy across a floodplain, it goes up. As it goes up, it gains gravitational potential energy. So you lift anything up, it gains energy. You drop it, it comes down with that energy. You take, a cubic flow of a stream, which would be a small stream, that's 1 tonne of water every second. If you lift, that tonne of water up, it gains gravitational potential energy. You take tens or hundreds or thousands of tonnes of water and you lift it up above a floodplain. If it, for some reason, comes over the top of that stop bank or through the side of that stop bank, it descends into that floodplain with an enormous amount of energy. So as long as the water stays in there, these people in the communities are safe, but if that water ever finds a reason or a way to get out, then that comes with a huge amount of energy and can do a huge amount of damage to those communities. And that's basically what we saw happen in Edgecombe, for example. That stop bank wasn't even overtopped, it just gave way. Taradale was lucky that the water was sort of spilling over the top and didn't completely come through, but you saw those other parts of the floodplain where the water did burst, come over and then cut a hole, and you can just see that fan where it's spread out into the floodplain. But yeah, it's that same story, right? We build a big stop bank and then we move in behind it, we think it's safe. So that's another consequence of this. And there is a cost to that. There's a cost to the ongoing maintenance of these schemes. There's a huge amount of money that has to go into the willow planting and the grassing and the fixing and the rock lining and keeping the river in that channel. But there's also the cleanup cost. Treasury's put the cost of asset damage from Auckland floods and Cyclone Gabrielle at between 9 and 14.5 billion. When you look at insurance payouts for weather-related damage across New Zealand in recent years, inflation adjusted to 2023. So this is some academics that wrote a blog post. The 2004 floods in the Lower North Island were exceptionally bad, so bad that the insured damage for the entire year was not exceeded until 2017. Since then, it has been exceeded every year. The total for 2023 exceeds that for the previous 14 years. Now, that's not to say that that's going to keep going up and up and up. It was maybe a bad year, but it might. It's a picture of potentially where we're going, right? And there's a human cost to this too. This is my friend rescuing a chicken from her property that flooded. Thankfully, her house was a bit higher. But it's everything small from that to the people that lost their lives in the flood, right? And everything in between, the bridges that were taken out, the not being able to get to school, the traffic, every time it rains, not being able to sleep, all that kind of stuff, and the inequalities that are exacerbated and all sorts of things that aren't factored into those costs. Some experts wrote a paper at the end of 2022 called Reanimating the Strangled Rivers of Aotearoa, New Zealand. They said things like working against nature does not work. We may inadvertently be manufacturing future disasters, and moving out of harm's way saves lives. Very prescient stuff a couple of months before the cyclone. Very similar stuff to what the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment said in their inquiry into flood mitigation measures following Cyclone Bowler in 1988. So 1988, the PCE said extensive deforestation has led to greatly accelerated widespread severe erosion. Took the forests off the hillsides. We shouldn't have, at least in the steep places. Draining of wetlands has intensified flooding problems in many areas. We took the spongy buffers out of the landscape. And unwise intensive development behind stop banks has often been encouraged. So we built stop banks and then we didn't communicate to people that they are not an absolute protection. They have a limitation. They are only designed to cope with a certain type or size of flood. But that was never really communicated. And these reviews keep coming out, right? So that was 1988. There was that paper in 2022. We're going to get a review into how the flood mitigation stuff worked during the cyclone. There was a report written just the other day by Andrew Newman, who was the Regional Council CE. This was about Wairoa stuff. I haven't read the full thing, but this was part of it summarised. He commented on the willows and things. Poplars and willows, which were deemed good flood protection alongside rivers, contributed 38% of the woody debris that filled waterways. Those trees lined on the riverbanks became part of the hazard. They're not a flood protection tool, they're an additional hazard. In terms of risk to infrastructure, blah, 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 you name it, arguably the biggest risk. Now, river managers would disagree. They would say they kind of need them to help protect the stop bank and things. But I think the point here is they work for those small floods, and then you get the big floods, and the rivers just rip them all out and do a massive amount of damage because they've been channelized, they haven't got that space to spread out, and we haven't slowed the water down in the landscape elsewhere where we can. Again, it's not to say that we're not going to still have problems by those big floods, but the way that we've managed the landscape is really exacerbating it. So as I say, we launched this Making Room for Rivers campaign end of 2022 as well. Coincidentally, we took the picture for the front of Waitangi Estuary where the two rivers come together, the Tutakuri and the Ngaruroro, which is kind of crazy. But basically trying to highlight that this situation is really problematic where we've got these narrowed stop banks, rivers that build up a huge amount of energy. And what we need to see is wider stop banks where rivers have the space to do their thing, to dissipate their energy, to slow themselves down, where we can have riparian areas and wetlands with native trees and stuff. We have space for communities, we have swimming holes, we have space for natural groundwater recharge, so we're not talking as much about dams and things like that damage our ecosystems. And we can have smaller stop banks for the same size floods because we can fit more water into that area. And if those smaller stop banks are ever overtopped, less damage is done because that water doesn't have as much energy because it's not as deep, it's not flowing as fast, etc. This leaves out another situation, which is getting people out of floodplains entirely in some places, which is an answer in some places and won't be the answer in others. It's this idea that's picked up from the Netherlands. You've probably seen their Room for the River program. At least it's picked up in this sense from the Netherlands. Of course, Indigenous communities have been living alongside rivers for a very long time, but this sort of branded Room for the River type idea comes from the Netherlands, where they basically figured out they couldn't keep building their stop banks high, they had to give space to rivers. They talk there in sort of like 1 in 1,000 year exceedance probabilities with their floods. If you're lucky in New Zealand, you might live in a town that has a 1 in 400 year stop bank or a 1 in 500 year, but over there it's 1 in 1,000, 1 in 1,500 years. So they are talking big stuff. And it's been picked up around the world through the 90s and the 2000s. We're decades behind. This is Munich. 8 kilometres of the river flows through the city. They turned it into this beautiful park where people swim and things all through summer. There's thousands of people on this beach if you ever look up pictures of that in summer. We're starting to pick it up in New Zealand a little bit. This is Horizons Regional Council with the Rangitike River. Basically, they have been trying to hem it into this space over here by the terrace for years with willows and things. They've got space and they realise that actually if they let the river have a bit more of that space, they'll probably spend less time and money trying to fight the river onto that other side. So they're looking at putting native trees back in here, getting rid of the willows, and letting it have this mobility corridor. Greater Wellington Regional Council with Te Awa Kairangi, the Hutt River, have just purchased all these properties in here. They've demolished most of them now. Basically, this is a pinch point on the Hutt River near Lower Hutt. They've modelled that if the river overtopped the stop bank here, it would do something like $1 billion worth of damage. For them, it was cheaper to buy $100 million worth of property. And while NZTA gets in here and builds a new bridge, they're going to open this up and turn it back into green space, give the river another 90 metres. There's still compromises here. There's a car park, but it can flood. There's still a stop bank that's going to be bigger and higher, but this gives them an opportunity to make some space and to try and turn the city to face the river a bit and recognise that they live on a floodplain. And they're changing some of their policy. They had this policy that said when considering hazard mitigation measures, particular regard should be given to the need for structural protection works or hard engineering. They've proposed to strike through that and instead prioritise non-structural, soft engineering, green infrastructure, room for the river or Tauranga Māori options. Not ruling out engineering, but saying in the first instance, let's go with the evidence, let's work with the rivers and with the landscape. Auckland Council announced it's making space for water plan after their extreme flooding. It includes a whole bunch of things from stormwater maintenance and things right through to daylighting streams. So we're yet to see how much of what goes on, but they have done some daylighting projects and things through time. And it's cool to see them adopt that approach. And it doesn't have to be big and expensive like those examples. This is an example from Canterbury where they've got some braided rivers that are just choked up with weeds and willows and things, and they are clearing it out and giving the rivers a bit more space again. That's the Waipara River. So we'd love to see more of that. In terms of our policy, we haven't really nailed this down yet either. We haven't got a drive, unless it's council goodwill and community sort of education and knowledge to do this. We have a national policy statement for freshwater management that says we should manage freshwater in a way that gives effect to mana o te wai. We should recognise that rivers have mana and they're entities in and of themselves, which I think we have learned of late. We should respect that. We should prevent the loss of river extent or avoid it to the extent practicable. So we shouldn't be encroaching on our rivers anymore. Habitats of indigenous freshwater species should be protected. So again, we shouldn't be encroaching on our rivers anymore and piping them and things. Unfortunately, the national policy statement is at risk at the moment with the new government coming in. So, the direction that this points us in is potentially going to be weakened again. And it is a really useful direction to try and, because even that, avoid the loss to the extent practicable. It's not like stay out of riverbeds and things, So even that's a compromise. We have this adaptation plan for New Zealand, first national adaptation plan that says we should prioritise nature-based solutions. It's not particularly binding as a policy document or anything, but the intent is there. And we have things like our regional plans. In Hawke's Bay, they're talking about the Kotahi plan. That's where we could be taking a different approach to things like gravel extraction and gravel management, flood protection, rules around encroachment into rivers, blah, 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 blah. All that kind of stuff. But it's got to be really combined, because when you look at the forests and the wetlands and the rivers, there's so many different things at play. Development, zoning, all sorts of things like that. One of the most important things, I think, is this proposed national policy statement for natural hazard decision making. Sounds kind of boring, but basically we don't have much policy in New Zealand that says don't build in high risk locations on floodplains. Instead we go ahead and allow them. If we say, oh, well, it's fine, just build your floor levels up or build a stop bank or something, you'll be fine. Or if we have a place behind a stop bank, but we're struggling, for example, to pay for the maintenance of that stop bank, we don't stop further development behind it, we just let it go on. And then we're sort of stuck in this path-dependent thing. So this would be really useful to actually say councils need to look at high, medium, low risk places. We need to talk about preventing development in high risk places, et cetera, which then becomes the first thing to stop bad decisions happening in the first place, which then allows us to look at more green space, in those areas where we shouldn't be building, and then, retreat beyond that and things. This also has a draft policy that says nature-based solutions should be preferred over hard engineering solutions, which would be really helpful. The drafting of that policy in full is not great yet, but there's been a lot of submissions that could improve it, so we really should be pushing the government to proceed with this one, even if they try and weaken the freshwater one. And just sort of give an example of this playing out in Hawke's Bay in some ways. This is a new development. People might be aware of Tangoyo. So different zoning places in Hawke's Bay, basically with the retreat, the category 3, the 2C, all the things you might have heard about in the news. But basically Tangoyo, there was a series of batches there, I think illegal ones, that were moved out over time. Someone came along, said, we want to make a batch-like development in this place back in 2008 or something. They got permission to do it. They took a private plan change through a hearing. At the time, the Hawke's Bay Regional Council said they were worried about the flood risk of the floodplains at Tangoyo. They asked the hearing committee to take a precautionary approach to the plan change. The committee, however, said it was happy with the protection plan, which ensured the buildings would be protected from a 1 in 100 chance per year of a flood. They got building consent in 2018 or 19-ish, and then the cyclone hit. They had built about 3 houses, and now the regional council is having to buy those people out after not wanting the development to go ahead in the first place. They probably should have fought it through to the Environment Court. They didn't. Councils tend to get scared of those cases, and this is a perfect example of why we need some policy that says do not go there. And we're seeing bad decisions still get made as well. This is the plan for Westport. I mean, I don't need to summarise this to you really. Just says walls. I don't know if this is the final version of the plan, but it's close to it. But it is kind of comical. It's literally walling in Westport on all sides. They got funding to finance some of this last year. And then, follow-up stories. Holes found in Westport flood plan. Plans to ring fence Westport with a series of flood walls could turn the town into a bathtub and increase the risk to life and property. So just crazy. We can't even stop making bad decisions now. And this one from Auckland, you might have seen 1,415 new homes consented on Auckland floodplains in the year since flooding disaster. To their credit, Auckland's doing a lot of trying to go around to people to say, do you understand these flood risks? You're in this zone, we need to do these things, et cetera, but their planning framework is still stuck in allowing this stuff to happen.
And a lot of it comes down to the fact that the developers can take the council to court.
Yeah, exactly.
So they refuse consent and then they just take them through court. So you're right, they're too risk adverse.
Yes, so there's a Ministry for the Environment guidance document on some flood risk or guidance or a report or something, and it basically says, hey, councils are scared of being taken to court for fighting development in high risk locations, and it cites that Tangoyo example as something that potentially went to court. That Tangoyo example, to my knowledge, didn't go to court. It seems there's this misconception amongst councils that they'll go to court and lose. And as far as we can tell, no one's actually been taken to court and lost. But there's this idea that there's that concern. I always like showing this picture. I don't know if you've seen this. This is the Rangitata River in 1937. It had a north branch and a south branch, Canterbury Plains. No surprises, that has been encroached on significantly. A stop bank or something was put in up the top. That south branch is now completely gone. This is a river with a water conservation order. Despite that, it's gone. It's been allowed to be developed as floodplain and as farmland and centre pivot irrigators and stuff. It's still owned by LINZ and DOC and the regional council and stuff. It's still mapped as a flood zone. And in 2019, when that river flooded, it went straight back to that old channel, busted through the stop bank or whatever it was. And after 20 years of never flowing there, it went straight back into that channel. In 1988, the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment said a possible effect of climate change is that cyclones of some form could pass close to New Zealand with increasing frequency. It may be that in retrospect, the Bowler Storm will not be regarded as such an extreme event. And they said, in the interests of future generations, government cannot allow the nation's floodplain land to be unwisely used. So we're at this point now, and we hopefully don't forget it, a year on from the floods, where we have to accept that our rivers, if we take the space from them, they're gonna take it back, basically. We talk about resilience and climate change resilience. Resilient rivers need room, as my old university lecturer says. Resilient rivers need room, and if we don't make room for them, they will take it. And as Hawke's Bay's seen, when the rivers try and take that space, it is not a nice experience to have, and we're much better off having proactive conversations about how we can make that room for them. I think it's really important that we keep our national policy statement for freshwater management. I think it's really important that we develop some natural hazard decision-making policy that says, we need to stop making things worse than the first instance. And I think we actually have to really paint a vision of, this is the best I could find from Hawke's Bay, I haven't been everywhere, but mixed landscapes, right? Where we have all things happening in a way that is healthy or relatively healthy, Because at the moment I think we struggle to imagine what we want the landscape to look like. We say, hey, we need to make room for rivers, and everyone goes, well, who's going to pay, and when are you taking all the stop banks out? Because, you're saying what, every floodplain is going to flood everywhere all the time, and we're like, no, that's not what we're imagining. Or we say we need to put forests back or wetlands back, and all they can imagine is going back to a pristine state, and we need to paint that picture or show examples of what that kind of compromise or that balance would actually look like, rather than the balance of 90% of wetlands gone, which is definitely not balanced. If anyone wants to read more about this stuff, we've got this Making Room for Rivers thing that we made pre-cyclone, but it's still very relevant, obviously. That's up on our website. There's that great paper, Reanimating the Strangled Rivers of Aotearoa. It's really readable. It actually gives 3 examples of locations where you could probably, or three examples, I think it's the Otaki, the Rangitata, and maybe the Hutt of rivers where you could do this really easily. The Rangitata, for example, it's still publicly owned land. It's not been heavily developed. through to the hut where it's like, look, you probably do want to do this, but it's heavily developed. Maybe nature-based solutions isn't going to be your option, but you can do some things. And the Otaki being kind of a half. It's really interesting case studies. And there's this book called Water Always Wins, which is a journalist going around the world looking at different cultures and how they work with rivers and flooding, because we think we have a big problem. We do. Flooding is one of our number one hazards, if not our number one natural hazard. But other countries, will be underwater for months of the year where they're on big river deltas and things like that. And it's really fascinating to see what other cultures do and how they live with water in their landscapes. So that's me. Thank you very much. That's not quite all our time. We've got about 10 minutes if people want to ask questions or anything. I've got some other pictures if people want to see more stuff, but I thought it would be more things to cram in, so I didn't want to put pressure on you. But yeah, thank you so much for having me. Well, I would hope so. I've done it something like 40 times now. in different ways. I try and change it every time just to keep me on my toes a bit. Put different pictures in. That's why it's good having some maps from you so I can change it up a bit. Yeah. You had a question? Yeah, I think we've gone to about 12 of the regional councils. So there's a few we haven't done. Probably Southland we haven't done, Northland we haven't done, Chatham Islands. We've been in front of Hawke's Bay Regional Council. We had half an hour in front of them, which was really good, followed by half an hour by the NIWA team who are doing that study on the Ngaruroro and the groundwater recharge. So it was really good for us to come in and say, look at the flooding impact, and them to come in and go, look, this is your aquifer recharge impact. We had half an hour in front of the Hawke's Bay Regional Council Māori Committee about a month ago. But yeah, we've got a bit like, they kind of, you get it, people get it, and the only barrier that we've really had is the who pays question. And it's really that misconception around how you do this, or that it has to all happen immediately, when really we have to sort of do it over time. So some good examples are Dunedin City Council with South Dunedin. They are looking at establishing a fund that they would slowly put money in over time, and as houses come up for sale, they would buy houses, they would keep letting people live in them, they would rent them out, whatever. Then if they reach some critical point, they'd go, actually, we're going to, that one's off the books now, we're retreating from that one, and slowly retreat from South Dunedin, for example. But yeah, so that's the main barrier that comes up. But we don't think about the other costs, because when you get the big event, often central government comes in and goes, we'll bail you out, the insurance companies come in, but as we start to see insurance retreat and things like that, it's going to fall more and more to councils and communities to figure it out. So yeah.
Which at the end of the day is ratepayers.
Yeah. And there's an interesting conversation there with ratepayers as well, because a lot of flood protection schemes are rated for who benefits from them. So the people who live around it pay for the stop bank, mostly in rural areas, that's the way that it's done, but in some other places too. Increasingly, there's not enough money to pay for those schemes. Councils are something like $450 million short across the country just of maintaining existing infrastructure. And they didn't get any money from central government in the last budget. So I say not what they wanted for that. So yeah, there's this question of, well, should it be a general rates thing? Should you all share in the cost? And you can, maybe all of New Zealand should share in. As long as it wasn't just engineering responses and building more walls, then I think there is an argument that we should all sort of contribute. The team of 5 million can all put in, and we can make sure that, we try and minimise loss of life going forward, and that we all benefit from more forests and more wetlands and more habitat and more groundwater recharge, all that kind of stuff. But it needs to be painted as that, not just painted as I'm paying for a stop bank for some rich house in somewhere to, benefit from it.
Because one thing I think we can do as hubs, we get a lot of visitors from MPs coming in, right from your local MPs, and in Tamakinakoa we get visits from a lot of the central MPs when they're coming through, and having copies of your report, that Making Room for Rivers, available to put into their hands as they're walking out the door and about to get back on a plane, is a great time to give it to them. And all you have to do is say, this is important to us, and we want you to read it, and let them go. And it, you know, like the more they know about it before they get to the point that there's any discussion going on is so helpful. And yeah, we did it with sort of stuff around energy. And yeah, I just think it's a perfect opportunity for some of us to, you know, help in a way to educate our politicians.
And we've done some really cool work with the Hawke's Bay group here in that them and Forest and Bird and Kahununu and maybe some of the Tai Whenua did a bit of a joint statement after the cyclones. Here's our wish list going forward, and you know, it was we need to reimagine our relationship with floodplains. We want a different approach to flood protection going forward. A bunch of other stuff in there as well, wetlands, forests, food security, that kind of thing. But yeah, that local, as you can see, it's some of these councils have done it off their own. You know, the Wellington Council, Auckland, they've done it off their own back, and we just need some leadership in Hawke's Bay, or some pressure as well. Bay of Plenty is a good council that's doing quite a lot of nature-based solution stuff, particularly in the coastal environment. Nelson area as well, maybe, but yeah, others definitely need a bit of nudging.
Do you champion sort of councils or things that are doing the right thing, or do you?
We try. I mean, I mentioned Greater Wellington a lot. Greater Wellington, Auckland. Yeah, it is really good to have examples. To start with, we struggled to find examples. When we made this Tukuana Awakiarere thing, we were looking for examples from New Zealand, and it was really hard to find them. Te Awakarangi, the hut, was the main one. There are small things, you know, little wetlands and stuff, but in terms of a big Making Room for Rivers type project, we really struggled to. We had, I think, one New Zealand one, an Australian one, and then a European one, just to show that this is the norm. But now we can find more. We did, for example, I might have it here, we made this map of historic wetland that is now grass but still publicly owned, and it's lots of slithers of land and stuff, but there's some big bits, Pamu farms, etc. And we started finding, like in Tauranga, there's a whole bunch of wetland with a stream running through it, the Kopererirua Valley, where they are now giving that river its meanders back and things, and that overlapped with a bit of old wetland that's publicly owned that was grass, and we were like, oh sweet, and it's like, great, you come across another example, and we're slowly building up those. We would love to do like a little booklet of case studies or something, even if it was just 10 from around New Zealand or something, so that's on our agenda, but by all means, if you guys did your own regional ones, it'd be great.
So is that public being Crown land and council land?
Yeah, so if councils could do this themselves, it would be better. They'd have better data than us, but we use the Central Record of State Land, which is kind of incomplete. It also holds some land that's like going to be given back to iwi, so you don't necessarily know, and it changes with time. But at the point we did it, 2022, yeah, it's all Crown lands, it's universities, it's councils, it's state-owned enterprises, all that kind of thing. Then overlaid with grass, high-producing and low-producing grassland. We should have done gorse and stuff as well, but we didn't. And historic wetland. So yeah, lots of biggest ones were LINZ, Pamu, Landcorp, and Department of Conservation. They're the main. And then it's some councils like Southland, Waikato, yeah.
So Tom, you mentioned the report that was written after Cyclone Bola. Was anything done? Were any of those recommendations actually taken up?
Yeah, I don't know that. We put forest back on hillsides in Gisborne. We put pine forest mostly. There was a bit of manuka and stuff done around like Lake Tutera and things, but mostly pine forest was put on hills. As I understand, although I need to fact check this, as I understand it was meant to stay there, or at least stay in public ownership. A lot of it was sold and put into rotational harvesting.
Right.
So we kind of took the lesson and then went, yeah. So hence why Gisborne is so badly hit so regularly. Yeah, but that was about the only lesson that we took.
And so given we've spent more than 100 years trying to contain and manage our rivers, what sort of time frame is needed to undo what we've done?
That's a really good question. I think in some ways we're in a really good position compared to Europe, where there's literally like brick-lined rivers that have been in place for thousands of years or 1,000 years or whatever. We're not quite there. We've only been doing this since really like the 40s. A lot of those schemes were sort of properly brought together under catchment boards and, to start with, it was stop banks individually by farmers protecting their bit of land, and the water would bounce off and flood the neighbours, and then they'd build their one, and then catchment boards kind of went, right, let's join them all up. So it's reasonably recent. And as a result of that, just as a side note, a lot of the stop banks, the quality varies. Some of them were made more recently with good engineering standards. Others were built with whatever happened to be on the side of the river in terms of the material that built them, so they're weaker or not as robust. But there's some huge opportunities, I think. But Rangitata, for example, you've got like government-owned land that has leases on it for grazing, but they're relatively short. And you've got the ability to let the river go there again pretty quickly. That doesn't need to be that could be 10 years easily probably. But it's that the problematic things I think we have really entrenched property rights, and we have really high land prices as a result of that as well, and no capital gains tax or anything like that. So land gets really expensive. Councils can't buy it because historically they've had really low rates. So where they could come in and say, right, we need to retreat from that, that's then really hard. We have people that are holding on to their land rights because they're like, I've been here for a generation, therefore I should be able to stay here. That's really hard. So we have a few cultural things we need to shift, and that'll be the harder spots. But where the land is public, I think those are the biggest opportunities. Or where we can illustrate a gain. Like I'd love the Ngaruroro one for the council to go, you know what, it's cheaper for us to widen the river here. They were paying to do an aquifer recharge scheme where they took river from a section near Roy's Hill, piped it for a kilometre or something to a site where they were, I guess, putting it in ponds or pumping it down into the ground to recharge 400 litres per second. The study that was just done there shows that if they could just widen that section of river again, they'd get 600 litres per second of recharge, and they'd get a wider flood channel. So that kind of joint benefit, if we can communicate that to farmers, for example, that would be really good.
But you're really talking generational change, aren't you?
Yeah, probably. I reckon we could do it within a generation for a lot of the bigger braided rivers. Yeah.
As hubs, what are the key things we can do to kind of help amplify your message? Because we've got pretty good reach across the country, and in most regions there's us. What can we like? We've got hubs, we've got messaging, we've got connections to probably tens of thousands of people. Like, what are the takeaways that we can do? The really useful things I've seen in Hawke's Bay are partnering up with iwi. Like Kahungunu has the same vision. So to jump in there and go, actually, we're a hub, we're representing some of the community, here's the Kahungunu vision, here's our vision, it's completely consistent for different reasons and for many of the same reasons. That's really powerful, I think, to get in front of a council and do that. That local advocacy to councils and decision makers is really useful to paint that picture of what your region could look like. You have a better idea of that than we do, I think. And you can be in front of them more often, build relationships with them, have trusted conversations with them, where we kind of come in and go, hey, here's this thing we think, and then we sort of disappear a bit again, although we do have some regional staff. And then you can probably do more granular stuff as well in terms of individual conversations with landowners going, and saying, how can we get wetlands back in, planting forests? It's smaller scale, but it's all like, I think the big thing is probably that cultural change of presenting that vision. But getting in front of your councils and saying, we need a better plan that, we want rules that do this for our landscape. We want you guys to push for a policy statement that says don't develop here. We want you guys not to develop in these stupid areas and blah, blah, blah. Those little things at a regional level. If you need to sneak off for morning tea, go. It's 10:31. But if you want to ask questions, feel free to hang around and ask whatever.